Hi, everybody. I'm Marianne Moenraj, and I'm director of the Speculative Literature Foundation, and we're here today with a panel on editing. We have three book editors with us, Maya Kleve, Diana Pho, and Chris Morgan, and we are looking forward to learning lots more about what they do and what they're looking for. So I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. We'll go in reverse alphabetical order by first name. So Maya, and then Diana, and then Chris.
Okay. My name is Maya Kleve. My company is MRK'd Editing, and I do mostly copy/line editing with some proof editing in there, and then also developmental evaluations. So I'll do basically a developmental edit, but I don't do a lot of in-document markups or anything like that. I've been doing various forms of editing for almost 10 years, starting with proofing and, of course, moving into developmental later on. And I'm out of Littleton, Colorado, and nice to meet everybody.
That's great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Diana Pho. I have been working as an editor for traditional publishing for almost 10 years. I've also had experience in corporate publishing in terms of like sales and social media. I was a blogger for a long time. And, you know, I am just really excited to talk about editorial. My most recent job actually is working podcasts. And for that, I've also edited audio dramas and served as a producer in that capacity. So I'm also more than happy to talk about audio work, but also the bridge between editing prose and editing for sound.
Okay, awesome.
And then I am Christopher Morgan. Most currently, I am working with Tor Books Group, or Tor Publishing Group. I forget what our new name is always. But I've been here since about the past 5, 6, 7 years, somewhere in there. I've been editing for 10 years. I started out cutting my teeth on an old romance blog called Heroes and Heartbreakers. And then I went over to Tor, and I do science fiction and fantasy, mostly for adults. And normally the bigger the book, the more likely I am to edit it. So that's what I'm here for.
When you say the bigger, do you mean like longer or?
Yeah, my most recent one is by author R.R. Virdi, which you can see kind of over the corner of my head, and that came in at 350,000 words. And it is not, it's enjoyable, but not, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Editing really long work.
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. So thank you all. And the brief relevant introduction for me is that I have edited 2 anthologies, Aquarotica and Aquarotica 2 for Random House. They're not science fiction fantasy. They're mainstream lit, although I think there was at least one mermaid story in Aquarotica. And we certainly got lots of mermaid submissions. So, and then I've edited an anthology. I found it in and edited for Clean Sheets, Strange Horizons, Jaggery, which is a South Asian lit mag. Strange Horizons is still going, but I'm not involved. Jaggery is still going, and I don't edit for them anymore. I just find the money. And then I have edited The Best of Strange Horizons, Volume 1, which was some selections from our first year, and Survivor, which is science fiction and fantasy stories of trauma and survival, which was a small press collection from Lethe Press. Whew. I think that's all of them, but I'm not sure, honestly. So I'm just going to throw out some questions as things go. So I think one thing that wasn't clear to me from your intro was whether you primarily work with individuals, small presses, big presses. If you could talk a little more about that.
Sure. I primarily work with freelancers, I freelance with indie authors. And then I also have a couple of smaller press clients that I do work for, anything from editing, and also I wrangle a proofing team for one of my presses. But that's a smaller part of what I do, but that's gotten me a lot of introductions to other authors and everything like that. I also forgot to specify, I do mostly science fiction, fantasy, thriller genres.
Okay, that's great. And Diana, you covered a whole range. I know that you did edit for Tor for a while, and that you were with Serial Box for a while. Are you primarily with anybody at the moment? Are you more independent now?
Yeah, so I've basically been collecting this toolkit, skill set, bag of holding, as you will, various editorial things. So I edited with Tor for almost 10 years. Before that, I was actually a blogger of Tor.com and worked in both like soliciting articles and writing articles myself. I also ran a multicultural steampunk blog called Beyond Victoriana, and my current job is with a company called Realm, which specializes in genre audio dramas and fiction. And before it became Realm, it was actually more of like an audiobook tangential company called Serial Box, which still specialized in genre. And while at Tor, I edited both like novel length and short fiction with Tor.com, and as I did prose as well as comic books. So it's like, again, I feel like I've done the whole gamut of what you could do in editorial for a lot of my time in publishing.
Excellent. Okay. I think that gives me a better sense. And Chris, you've been primarily at traditional publishing, it sounds like.
I've done a lot of long form editing. The short stuff I've done has been mostly blog posts and some short stories for some video game companies to run on their websites.
Okay. Perfect. And we have a really wide range right now of the options available to authors, which is great. I love that. I came up in traditional publishing as since I've been writing for 30 years, the first decade or so, it was all about submitting to traditional publishers. At some point, I discovered small presses, which were particularly good when I was writing work that was riskier, that the traditional publishers were not sure they knew how to sell, or it wasn't fitting into one of their market categories they already had defined. So we love the small presses. And more recently, I'm both for myself and for lots of writers I'm talking to, more and more of us are doing at least some of our work indie published direct to the reader. So the field, I would say, has changed a lot in just the past 30 years. And one thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is there was this phrase that was thrown around all the time back in the day: money flows to the writer. And 30 years ago, I would absolutely have, been promulgating that and sort of saying you should never pay for editorial services. It's always going to be a scam. Or you should never pay for an agent. They take a percentage of your cut, but they don't pay anything up front. The sort of standard things to tell beginner writers. And I think that was mostly true back then, but I wouldn't say it's true now. So I guess here's my question to you. And this actually, I think, applies to all of you. And maybe I'll start with Chris. Let's say you've got a new writer, they've written a novel. They're planning to submit to traditional publishing, at least initially, right? Should they spend money on paying an independent editor to look at their work first?
So I come across this question a lot. I do a lot of work with the Writers Symposium at Gen Con, and it's a lot of indie game writers coming together, and I get this question often. I think that if you're going the traditional route, the old adage of money should flow downhill, to the writer, money should always go to the writer, holds true. You're dealing with a multi-million-dollar corporation that makes its living off of creative work. And if they're being stingy with their money or being stingy with their time, then you shouldn't do anything extra to invest in that. I feel, and this might be where people disagree with me, I feel the same way if you choose to work with an agent. You should not pay an agent for their services because theoretically they should be being paid when you get paid. And so that is their incentive to work. So you want them to work for you because that is their job. However, how publishing has changed, it's more of an a la carte service, and you trade off how much money and time you want to invest versus how much time and money you want someone else to invest. With traditional publishing, you get kind of a full service thing, but they're also going to take the most money out of you. But you're going to get the most time theoretically to devote to writing. But the further you get and more indie you get, whether you're just a self-published person working on your own on KDP or Kindle Direct Publishing, then you're paying for everything on yourself. You're paying the editor, you're paying for the marketing, you're paying for the publicist, you're doing everything on your own, and you're being your own project manager, which is what you normally do with a traditional editor. You're giving your share of the money on that side to a project manager. But yeah, on a traditional side, it absolutely should be rolling downhill, and you should not have to have a book pre-edited before it goes to a professional traditional editor. That editor's job is to be able to look past any kind of formatting or like typos and see the meat of the story and the writing ability. I mean, that's what we spend all of our time and effort developing, is being able to recognize that talent. And so you should not have to pay someone else to edit and make it look like it is a finished book when it is their job, theoretically, as a traditional publisher, to make it a final book.
So I mostly agree with you. I'm going to poke at it just a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
Only because, one thing I hear a lot from newer writers is they're anxious, right? They know it's a competitive market. They know it's tough even before it gets to you, the editor, just to find an agent, right? And they want to be sure that this project of their heart stands out, and that they're giving it its best shot. And in the old world, I would have said, well, that's what workshops are for. You find other writers, whether you're putting up flyers at your local library or bookstore or doing it online, and you get a writing group, and then you exchange critiques. And so you're not putting out any cash, but you get that feedback. Also classes, right? Writing classes are another way to get feedback from both classmates and an instructor. But that said, I do know people who have found a lot of value in, say, a writing coach, just to help them, even get the full project out on the page, or paying a developmental editor, to a freelance developmental editor to look at the work and guide them. So what are your thoughts about getting it to the stage where you're comfortable starting to send it to agents, for example? And
I mean, I have a couple of thoughts, and what I think, I think what Chris said, has a lot of valid points. If you are working for a large corporation that is invested in their editorial staff, and that's part of the expectations of the job, is to be able to elevate the works that you advocate and acquire, to hit that level that is satisfying for the publisher and for the readership. The counter I would say, however, is that there is a lot of pressure in corporate culture to produce certain types of books at a certain timeline. And oftentimes when an editor who is working for a larger company says no, even if they love the story, there's a lot of different factors in that no. One of the factors is, do I have enough time in the day to actually bring this book up to the level it needs in order to sell? And so I can understand that even, if, because I've definitely been those situations myself, I may have asked for a revise and resubmit even before thinking about bringing it to the editorial board or something like that, because I know there's something there. But then what comes back isn't exactly up to the level that I need to convince the other people, including the people holding the purse strings, to buy into the project as much as I love the project. So I can see the argument, for like a writer going in, if they're aspiring to publish at a certain level, or with like a certain publisher, it's something that writers don't necessarily know, which is, what are the interior expectations that the publisher has in creating their overall strategy, So a question I actually, because I've done freelance editorial for a while myself, and what I often ask writers when I first discuss the possibility of working with them is, have you considered where you want your book to be? Whether it is with a large big 5 publisher, whether it's with like a smaller mid-size or indie house, or whether it's self-publishing, because each one of those levels contains different like publishing cultural expectations that the book needs to have in order to reach that level to get that yes.
Mm-hmm. That's useful. Maya?
Yeah. There's different types of things that you're looking at too. If it's a developmental thing, and I think I would say if they're a newer author and they haven't had the experience with critique groups or beta readers or anybody else giving them any type of story structure feedback or how their story flows or if the story works for their readers, then I would really recommend that they get a developmental edit, because there's the potential that they've got a really great story there, but if they start shooting it out to all of the publishers and they're hoping to get one of the larger publishing houses to look at it, they're going to run into the problem of, well, I can see there's something there, but I'm not sure what the author's trying to do, and we don't have time to develop it. And I think that's one of the big issues right now is time. How fast can the publisher get it to market? Right now, I know that most authors, when they talk about going the trad route, most people who've done the traditional publishing route are like, it can take anywhere from 2 to 3 years. And the look on the faces of the new authors when they hear that's how long it takes, they're just so discouraged. So if they haven't had anybody else look at it, then I would recommend they at least get beta readers. If they can get a professional beta read, which happens to be something that I do, which is basically, how's my story work? Is it something that I can just start going ahead and sending out to the publishers, or do I need to develop something else or work on something specific to that story before I start giving it to agents, giving it to publishing houses and things like that? What can improve their chances of getting that yes back from whoever they're submitting to? And I've hit people everywhere in between. One of the first people I did the beta read for was a guy who had polished his story until it's as good as it's going to get until the publishing house gets a hold of it. And somebody had told him, well, you need to go through a dev edit again. He's like, I've already put $5,000 into this in editing. Do I really need to do that again? And I read through it and I was thinking that he had a huge amount of problems. But when I finally got to the point where he revealed what he was doing in his book, 75% of my comments went away. Mm-hmm. And when I sent it back, I said, if you're submitting to agents and publishers at this point, I would not run it through another editing pass. Just anything else that needs to be done, it's going to be specific to make sure that it's what they want for their market. Mm-hmm. And he was so much happier hearing that than, oh, you need another dev edit that's going to cost you another $3,000. So I think that newer authors need to have a little bit of feedback, and sometimes if they can find somebody who will give them a beta read from an editorial point of view, then that helps them out. And it's usually just a much smaller investment in money for them, and so then they're a little less panicky when they hear what the different costs of editing are.
So I want to get to that, but before that, I want to just kind of highlight two things that came out of what you all said. One of them is the idea that I think Diana brought up about time. I feel like this is really, really important, because I do think that the sort of traditional model assumes that you, the writer, have more time than money. And that's not necessarily the case, right? So something like the traditional model of like you join a workshop, you're reading other people's work, you're giving them feedback. Maybe your short story gets critiqued like once every 3 months. If you're working on a novel, a couple chapters of it get critiqued once every couple months. I'm sorry, it got really loud here. Are you guys hearing that?
Oh, no, you're fine.
Okay, so it is, I think it's outside snow blowers, so I'm gonna try and ignore it if it's not making it to you. So, so it could be that, and maybe you are a working parent, maybe you have elder care responsibilities, maybe you have a host of things that make it difficult for you to participate in a monthly workshop, right? It might be that time is in fact your limiting factor, and that maybe you have a good day job and you can afford to spend a couple $1,000s, and that's easier for you to do than to spend the time to exchange critiques. I think that's a fair thing to think about, and sort of every writer is going to have to decide that for themselves. But I guess the point I'm trying to get to is that it's not as simple as you never pay for things, right? You're paying for it. You're either paying for it, you want the feedback, you want to learn how to be better, and you will pay for it. You'll either pay for it in money or you'll pay for it in time. And especially Maya pointed out that people get discouraged, right? Arts do not have a simple track that you follow, like go to med school and in 5 years, if you pass everything, you're a doctor, right? So we don't have anything like that. And I meet so many writers who, if they don't succeed within 3 months or 6 months or a year, if they don't get too published by then, they feel like they've failed, right? And so I think that's another thing that the writer has to kind of factor into their own mental framework is, if throwing $2,000 at this will speed up the process for me, that might be worthwhile, right? Like that's a very individual decision. I'm so wary of scammers that I feel very hesitant giving this advice because I think it's really easy for writers to spend much more money than they need to on this kind of thing or than they should and get very little back in return. So here's my next question. Wait, actually, before I move to that, the other thing that I wanted to call out from what Maya said is this question of how much do you want to finish the work before you start submitting it to the place you'd like to have publish it. And, we always say, send your best work, right? But it's sort of an interesting question of like, what if you get it to a good stage and it is a beautiful book, but it's not the kind of book that they want. And they come back to you and they're like, this is great, but we'd like it to be a much more commercial thing. We want more action scenes and more, blah, 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 blah. And then you have to decide, is that something you're willing to do? And I think if you've invested a lot of time and energy into making it one thing, it can be very hard to be willing to shift it to something else. So actually, let me ask your thoughts on that. As I think it relates to kind of what Chris was saying too at the beginning about, like as an editor, part of presumably the joy in the work for him is helping the writer shape the book. And so if it comes to you complete, is that frustrating? Is that, or are you just delighted that you're like, oh no, this is great, I can just send it out?
I mean, just speaking from my end and where I am at in the industry, inflexibility is not an attractive quality when it comes to a writer, because there are situations where it's like, look, especially in epic fantasy or space opera, when you get like big, chunky, multiple 100,000 word books, it's like, look, right now we're physically approaching the limits of what a commercial industrial printer can do. And we just simply need to make cuts. So you're going to have to cut this book in half or something. And then Someone that's a little bit more flexible and indie can just say, I'm just going to do E only. I do not have that option where I cannot just choose to do an E first book or do an audio recording of a book. I don't get to make that call. So when you approach a book and you're like, this book is done and finished, and it is 600,000 words, and it is the next George R.R. Martin, that's super. I'm glad for you, but there's nothing I can do with that.
I'm reminded. I think it was Tad Williams' Dragonbone Chair that it was a trilogy, and then the last book was so long they actually could not print it and had to split it into two books. And if he had not been wildly popular, I'm not sure they would have ever brought out the last book, right?
I believe that when Diana might know since she worked more closely on the franchise, but I believe that's how Wheel of Time ended up. The last book of Wheel of Time became Towers of Midnight and Banner of Light. I forget what those books are called, and I'm a bad Tor employee for forgetting that.
But you risk having the series canceled, right?
Right.
So flexibility is, editors do appreciate some flexibility, and I come from the academic MFA, PhD, creative writing side of things, so I have a lot of writer friends who are in it for the art, right? And their focus is, no, I've spent 20 years writing this jewel of a book that expresses everything in my heart, and I want it to stay exactly like this.
Yeah.
And that's fine. Then you have to know what to do with that.
One of the first places I always go to was when I was working in romance, and we were doing an excerpt of this romantic suspense. So lots of gun chases in between kissing. But we got the cover, and this is also about 10 years ago in publishing, so a different landscape. Hopefully it's changed. I know it maybe hasn't. But the author had not yet seen their cover. And so we were working with SMP, or I forget who it was. It was either SMP or somebody, but that doesn't matter. We got their cover and be like, this is what's going up. This is the post. Just want to let you take a look at it before we hit publish. And the author's response was, I guess I'm writing a boat scene now, because there was a speedboat on the cover with our romantic couple on board. And it was just one of those moments that always makes me think of the flexibility of especially genre writers, romance, mystery, science fiction, fantasy. They can't be, book of their heart doesn't always fly.
Yeah.
So,
Especially if they want to do a big commercial house, right?
Yeah.
So,
Now, I did have a recent experience with my smaller publisher, and I got asked to do I've been asked to do a lot of first book in series because, especially if they're newer authors or authors who haven't worked with publishers before. And I went through it and I got to the end and I'm like, so this feels like it's the middle of a book one. I had not been given all the information on this particular book. And the way it ends might make the readers very unhappy. So I don't know if we need to change this, or if we need to, and this is back to the head of the publishing company, if we need to change this, or if you need to move up the release of the next book. Because me, as a reader, if I got to that point, I'd be like, what the heck? And come to find out, it was the middle of a much larger book.
I think it at least helps to set expectations appropriately for your readers, right? And go ahead and label it book one of the trilogy.
Well, luckily we knew it was going to be a multi-book series, but there's a different anticipation of book one, and no, this is really part one of two.
Right.
type of thing.
And
so
I was thinking about your comment, Marianne, just like interact with all writers that write books with different intentions behind them. Like each book is very unique in where it's coming from, both like in the author's place in their life when they wrote it, why they wrote it, and what it's actually about. And so one of the things that I think an editor, and it's different if you work for a company versus if you work freelance, because if you work freelance, it's basically like, editors in general should be supporting an author's vision. But if you're working your own business as an editor, it's getting that project to the point that it meets whatever, like whoever is paying you the money, basically, whether it's the author's intention, whether it's a small publisher or another publisher that you work for on a freelance basis. And if you are working, for a more corporate company, or if you're working as just part of a larger company, as part of editorial staff, one of the things to think about is the projects that you're looking at. Does it fit the company brand? Does it fit the market that this company's good at doing? And does it fit your own personal tastes, comfort level, and strengths as an editor? There was a reason why I never edited the same books that Chris has done at Tor, because I just don't do epic fantasy. I can't, put all those 1,000 pages and stick it in my brain and have it come out right. I know that's not my strength. On the other hand, this is why I dabbled in comics. It's why I did short fiction. It's why my taste and Chris, while we have a lot of commonalities, if you're an agent submitting any book project and choosing between us, you would know exactly what the differences are. And I think it's really important for also writers to be very familiar if they want to work with a certain company or a certain editor. It's really helpful for them to figure out what the editor's taste is and whether their taste and vision would potentially match the taste and vision of their book.
Right. And I will say, from this working with small press editors, for me, a lot of that comes in the initial conversation with the small press editor, right? I've submitted the work, or they've found my work, and they've expressed an interest. And then we have, so for example, this week I have a book coming out from Riverdale Avenue Press, Tornado, which Laurie Perkins is the editor there. And it is it's a memoir. It's a log that I kept during breast cancer treatment. And so when we had the first conversation, she's also a survivor, and which was not necessary, but it's helpful because it gave me a sense that she would be respectful and treat the material appropriately. And then she also was clearly going to edit with a very light hand, which was important to me because this was a log, right? It was live. It was kind of kept during the treatment. And so any heavy editing would I think would have messed with the integrity of the book. And that was important to me. I would rather not have the book come out than have it be messed with that way. And so this is where I go to the kind of art piece of it, of if you have reasons why it needs to look a certain way, I would say small press or indie may end up a better fit for you. Which is not to say it can't go to a big press. It's just a little tougher, I think, because you really need a big press where the editor is on the same page as you, and they do that kind of book exactly the way you wrote it, which just gets harder. So let me shift the conversation a little bit. So when we do pay for services, I'm going to go back to this because this is maybe not so relevant to Chris, but how are writers supposed to figure out who to trust and what is a reasonable amount of money to pay for any given services? Does SIFWA put out guidelines? Is there a directory? It feels very Wild West to me right now, and maybe I'm just missing resources that are out there.
So I don't know that SIFWA puts out anything. However, the Editorial Freelancers Association does a poll of their regular freelancers every few years, and they collate what the average price is, and then they give a range. The one thing I will say about EFA, though, and that particular price list page is that it actually tends to lowball what some of the services are. I use that as a guideline when I do my pricing, and that's where anybody that asks me about getting into freelance work and getting into doing their own editing stuff, and they're trying to figure out what their pricing should be or what their pricing structure should look like, I send them there. I'm like, look this over, realize it's on the low end. But usually for people that are starting out, they feel more comfortable not charging a lot anyway. So it also goes back to, usually you get what you pay for. Yeah, but not always. So you will have good people on the low end, and you'll have bad people on the high end. I mean, that's just the way it happens. I just finished doing 2 samples One was the guy got back to me and he's like, I don't think this is going to work. Not a good fit. I'm like, great, good luck. No hard feelings there. It's not a problem. Another person I sent a sample to, he was like, holy cow, yeah, sign me up. And so if you can, and somebody told, I heard somebody say that they wouldn't do samples, and I don't necessarily agree with that, because I think both for the editor and the author, it's important to know what type of feedback you're going to get and how heavy the editor might be, depending on the kind of edit you're looking for. And I might say copy edit with some line editing, because those are kind of two adjacent services. And what they're expecting is more of what would be a proofread. So very light touch, very only when it's necessary. Whereas what I'm talking about is, oh no, I'm going to be rearranging your sentences for you. So, and that sample lets them understand, oh, when she means copy and line edit, she means copy and line edit. She's going to be really changing things around. So I think for both sides, those are very good. And the other thing that I do when I'm doing the samples is that lets me know where on, because I have a price list out there, or I have a baseline of pricing out there, but that tells me if I need to go up or down from that baseline. So
yeah, and all those are really great points, Maya. Like, a couple of things that I also want to add is, I've also, when I did freelancing, I also did samples for people like who requested it, just so they know exactly what they're getting into and what it actually means. And I also, you're right, if you are a freelance editor that is starting on their own, establishing their business, I can understand having like a certain like discount price range just to get clients' foot in the door. And then after you have done it for like a year or two, just like changing your rates to accommodate for both inflation and taxes, and also, your growing reputation as an editor. I do, completely also understand, like, in the last couple of years, a lot of editors have left the corporate world to strike out on their own. And I've told them always, always remember that you are also going to pay a lot more in taxes for all the services that you do. So remember to charge your rates accordingly. And you also have to get your own healthcare, most likely. And so remember to charge accordingly for that as well. Another thing that, I do think is like a little bit of a difference between someone who is starting up with any sort of like traditional publishing background is that it's not just you're selling your services as, a developmental editor, you're selling your services as a marketer, as someone who already knows how to position a book, as someone who can give advice about what the current publishing sphere is like, as someone who might have, additional information about how to find an agent or what the different cultural styles of different houses are like. And that is part of your service too. And I think that could be appealing to a lot of writers to have that information in hand.
That's really interesting. I almost wonder, so when I was doing a cookbook recently, I was indie publishing it, and I was going to do, so I was hiring someone to do design, cover design, and also interior design. And with that, you can look at their previous work and see examples. So at least you can figure out if you're on the same aesthetic page as these people and if the work looks up to professional standards, et cetera, right? And even with that, it turned out that the first person I hired, which was a kind of lowball offer, lowball price of $500 for the cover, I was really unhappy with their work and ended up just paying them and not using it. And I think one thing and it was the first time I'd paid for cover art. And I think one thing that it didn't occur to me to ask about were things like, like how many revisions are you willing to do revisions? Are we able to will you do some drafts for me to look at first? And then we'll like settle on a direction and so on. And, I think for $500, what he was willing to do was to go grab some photography and stock photography and throw on the title and the author and mess with fonts a little. And that is totally fine. That's, but it wasn't what I was looking for. And I ended up hiring a professional at a much higher rate. I don't remember offhand, closer to $2,000 or $3,000, I think, instead of 500, who did just stunningly beautiful work on both the cover and the interior. And I think it was well worth it. So I guess I'm wondering a little bit. So the samples are obviously valuable. I think that's clearly seems valuable to me. I almost wonder if it would be worth it to have freelance editors, like put up a sort of I don't know, not a fake sample, but an example, right? Of here is a, rough page. Maybe you could get a writer friend to give you like a page of one of their manuscripts. And this is what I would do to it for this level of editing, So I don't know. This is just a thought. I'm like, oh, that might be useful. So I could at least, so someone could at least see an example. And especially because I think a lot of my students are not familiar with the different levels of editing, right? Mm-hmm. They don't know what developmental editing it means until I tell them. They don't know about copy editing. They don't know about proof. I mean, just they kind of think everything's proofreading sometimes. And so when they realize how much more there can be to editing, they get confused. So anywhere where we can put more clarity in that process is probably helpful, right?
One of the things that I found has really helped is I actually put definitions on my webpage under each. I separated out by proofing, copy and line, and developmental, and I give a definition that I basically I went out and found something and then I reworded it so that I wasn't stealing it or anything like that. But and I think that's one thing that's helpful. Samples are tough to post just because authors, even trying to get permission for that sort of stuff, they're just kind of like, I don't know if I want to put that out there.
I will write a really bad page for you and give it to you.
Right. But one of the things I do have up there is I've got testimonials from previous clients. And then I have on my publisher page, I have the covers of all of the books that I've worked on.
Yeah.
And so then if they want to see the kind of stories that I've worked on, the kind of books I've worked on, and potentially see the kind of end product that comes out of it, they can go ahead and see what I've got and they can pick up the book. And if they're on Kindle Unlimited, of course, they can read it for free. They don't have to actually spend any money on it. And then they can go and ask for the sample if they still want it. I think the other part of it is it's harder for me as an editor to have something and say, okay, well, this is an example of what I did, but how does that relate to their work? How is that going to change? Is it going to change their voice? Is it the types of changes that I'm going to be making? So, and I know that I've had instances where I've done work for somebody and they're like, this isn't what I was looking for. And, we've had to come to an agreement on, I'm sorry, this isn't what here's a refund or whatever. So, and that happens. And luckily I haven't had it happen very often. And I've had it happen even less, of course, with the samples, like the individual that I heard back from this morning, don't think this is going to work. Thank you for your time. Move on. So I don't know about you, Diana, if you've had any thoughts about putting samples online or on your website or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, I've done the same as you have, like, author testimonials are really helpful, and like a listing of like the previous books that I've worked on, because also one of the things to be wary of, if it's not original writing generated yourself, it's a copyright issue, even if it's a previous draft, and I know authors are just being more wary of like, showing how much of their original work is online. And they want to, protect their IP, which is perfectly fair.
All right. Well, maybe my idea will not fly, but I think it would be helpful. Maybe we'll just do, I almost just want to have examples of like, here's a manuscript page. This is an example of what a developmental editor might say to it. This is what a, light editing with copy edit might look like. This is what proofreading looks like, just so people, so maybe we'll do that at the SLF site, just so people can see what the differences are. And
Definitely, that's
if they're not familiar, right? So, and I'll note that, even with something which is the same thing, right? Like, so when I did a book with HarperCollins, it was, Bodies in Motion was a book that had been through years of workshopping. I wrote it in grad school, so my advisor had looked at it. So it was very complete by the time I submitted it, right? They did almost nothing to it. Like, they suggested I add a genealogy at the front. They changed a couple names because they were too similar, or they asked me to change a couple names. And that's basically it. There was like tiny proofing notes, and that's it. As opposed to when I was writing for Serial Box for Tremontaine, the editor that I had on that was doing copy editing where she was, as Maya was saying, she was changing every sentence, making suggested changes to every sentence. And it was fascinating to me. I've only once had an editor like that in 30 years. And I didn't, I could see why she was making the changes. And I think I accepted them all because they did make it read a little cleaner all the way through, right? So I could see what she was doing. It did also bother me because it didn't quite feel like my voice anymore, right? And so I was like, oh, this is like a cleaner version of Marianne. Do I really want that? So it's just an interesting thing. Like, both places were professional places doing professional level copy editing, but the editors brought a very different attention to detail level and willingness to mess with the author's text.
Yeah, it's, I've definitely been academically published by, editors who had a very heavy hand in line editing for like articles, but I find that really helpful. Editors like to be edited because sometimes you just don't know because you've never had that experience yourself on the other side. But also I think in particular in your case, between the difference between that first published book and the work on Tremontaine is Serial Box, Now Realm, has a constantly evolving editorial style that shifts with the market acceptance of audio drama. And, part of the thing that it's what I was speaking about earlier, like, what is the culture of the house? What does the book fit in with the house brand? How can your voice as an editor work with them? And in some cases for format, a lot of the changes isn't necessarily stylistic changes because the voice wasn't right. It could be just a tone pass because you're working for writer's room with a bunch of other writers and that tone had to be consistent throughout the project. Yeah. And also when working with audio, there is a difference between writing for audio drama, versus writing for an audiobook format or a format to be read out loud. And I guess to do a really quick plug of a future article, my next piece for Uncanny Magazine in issue 50 is all about the differences between writing for audio and things that writers new to the format might think about.
Mm-hmm. So, I would say, I guess this goes back to the thing of knowing the publishing house, right? Because I write for two different collaborative series. I wrote one season on Tremontaine, and I write ongoing for George R. R. Martin's Wildcard series. And Tremontaine tries much harder, or Serial Box at the time, tries much harder to maintain that consistency of tone with the different authors. And maybe it's because they're looking at audio as a focus. Wildcards does not, right? Like they do not edit to make us sound consistent at all. Some of the books are collections of linked short stories. Those are wildly different, but even the ones that are mosaic novels, they don't do that level of editing to smooth it out, which is an interesting choice. It makes for a different feel in the book, less cohesive, right? So, I don't know what I would do if it were my project. So it's interesting to think about. Maya, you wanted to add something?
Oh, well, I thought it was over a series because I do work on a shared universe series,
Mhm.
and we don't mess with voice very much between the different books.
Mhm.
And a couple of those books have co-authors, and that is one of the things where you have to basically smooth out the voice through the book to make sure that there isn't, it doesn't sound like one person more than the other. And luckily, all the co-authored stuff, for the most part, the authors have already done that to a certain extent, but sometimes you have to, if they share a character all of a sudden, and that's how they do it, is they have different characters. But if they share a character all of a sudden, it's like, okay, no, the character doesn't sound like this right now. And so
Yeah.
you have to edit for the character, how the character sounds. And I think that that's a much more important thing when you're doing like a mosaic or a co-authored or a blended story, is you have to make sure that the pieces of the story all mesh together, as opposed to, so it's not really author voice, it's story voice.
But just to highlight, that's an editorial choice, right? Like,
Yeah.
so wildcards, our fans don't seem to care, right? They don't seem to
Sure.
mind that it's not cohesive and that you can tell who's written each section, right? If anything, maybe they like it.
Yeah.
What we do for character voice is we, the authors, do pass our sections with other people's characters to them to look over for checking the dialogue.
Sure.
And also to make sure we haven't had the character do something wildly out of character from the author's point of view.
Yep.
And we get sign off. So that happens between the authors before it gets to the editor.
Yeah, and we have in the shared universe, there have been instances where people have borrowed characters and they do the same thing. They say, here's the section with your character. Can you make sure that they're not saying or doing anything that's out, or make sure that it sounds like your character? And then they just take it back and they plop it back in and
Right.
move on. So yeah, they something very similar. And nobody has ever complained, well, I didn't like this character in this author's hands because it didn't sound like them. There's been none of that as far as I know.
Which I think is one of the big illustrators of why an editor is important, especially when you're doing adaptations and tie-ins. Like just looking at comics, right? You see comics and you see someone trying to adapt John Constantine again. And, oh, he's not bisexual this time, or, oh, he's not smoking this time. And the people that you're going to get the reaction from are readers. I mean, it's not necessarily going to be the writer, because they're going to get everything that they want out of the character. And they're just not going to focus on the bits that mean most to them. But I mean, or Witcher, most recently, everyone upset that Henry Cavill is leaving because he really respected the character in the books and the video games. That consistency between voices is most important when you're adapting works for different formats or multiple formats.
Sorry, I had something, I got distracted by Henry Cavill because I thought like, well, I need
It happens. It happens.
So, that's why we're upset. Anyway, sorry, putting that aside for the moment. Okay, I was going to come back to you, Chris. So thanks for jumping in there. Oh, well, so I was thinking about Ty Frank and Daniel Abraham collaborating on what's the name of it?
The Expanse.
Expanse,
right? Which is tremendously smooth. When I read those novellas and novels, I cannot tell who wrote what part, right? Like I have no idea how they do it. But it reads very, very smoothly and brilliantly. And I think it adapted beautifully to the screen as well. So that was just sort of a book length note of how this stuff works. Maybe if you could talk a little bit about, as we're coming up to, we have about 15 minutes left. Oh, and sorry, guests, if you have any questions you'd like us to address, please feel free to throw them in the chat. That's probably the easiest way to make sure we ask them. So I wanted to do basically two more questions. I want to be sure to get in before the end. The first one is for any authors reading who are interested in traditional publishing. What if they're like, oh, I'd really like Chris Morgan to edit my books, right? What do you recommend to them? What is the process they should go through? What are
I do not currently take on unsolicited submissions. I'll go ahead and say that out. I do read and appreciate anything that's unrepresented, but I do not, just because I've seen an agent's inbox and I do not want that. Most likely, if you catch me online or catch me on something like this, or like I say, I work very closely with the Writers Symposium at Gen Con. If you catch me there, if you catch me in person and get me sitting down and over a cup of coffee, I have bought many books over that and helped many people find agents and representation because of those times. But do not just call or find my email and send me a manuscript, because then I probably will not look at it. But I'm always happy to talk about publishing, and traditional publishing in particular, because it is labyrinthine and arcane, and no one actually knows what it is because we're all just reading tea leaves. And so I will always theorize and theory craft on how best to get you traditionally published. And sometimes I might be right. So just feel free to hit me up in any social space in which I am publicly available.
So step one is write 900,000 words.
Exactly. Absolutely. Yeah. Step one, write the longest possible book you can imagine, and throw in another a rule book and a story Bible, and then we can start talking.
So, well, that is great. And is there a brief advice on like how to get an agent that you would like a short version of it?
I think the best way to find an agent or an editor is to, one, read the acknowledgments of any book that you like and any author that you like and any author whose career track you want to reproduce. That author will always think they're editors, they're agents, and oftentimes they're beta readers. And that will give you an idea of where to start looking. Because if those people are writing things that you like, then the people they're working with are reading things that you like. I also encourage any amount of professional stalking. So social media is a thing that we all use. And anything that is publicly available in a public profile is free game, because that's why it's public. But do not stalk people's private Instagrams or private Twitter accounts, because that is creepy and weird.
Yeah, I'll also add that there is a great resource called Writers Beware. So if you're worried about, who are the scam agents, who are like the bad publishing houses, it's a really, really great, always updated resource, about those types of conversations. So that's why, I always recommend that. I also want to add that if you are, I know like Twitter's, who knows what's going to happen to Twitter? And it's unfortunate because a lot of publishing people, and a lot of writers use it as a resource to get their latest news. And so what I, have to recommend is that if we are turning back time to like 20 years ago and going to the library, getting that, writer's market. It's now a database too online. It's a subscription service. And you can also look up information about publishers and agents that way as well.
That's how I started with Poets Market 30 years ago. So
I mean, speaking of traditional routes, AO3, our fantasy writers, all the communities are still there. They're just more segmented and splintered, but they all have message boards or the equivalent thereof in terms of finding out good information. Like, what's this guy like? What has anyone worked with him?
That sounds great. And we'll get all of this information and put it in the show notes. So I think we need to start building some bigger lists at the SLF for all of this. So it's not as piecemeal, because AO3 I'm familiar with, but the other two groups you mentioned I've never heard of them, and I've been doing this for a long time. So it's really easy to be splintered and miss major things. Diana, so you have services that are just available on your site. If someone is interested in submitting to Realm and potentially working with you, any advice on what they should do as their next steps?
Yeah, so Realm creates their shows in various different ways. You can always go to the website, and contact us for like general inquiries, you can also check whether they're actively looking for like unagented submissions. Like at this time, we are currently only working with agented submissions, but that could change in the future. So feel free to like just go to realm.fm, scroll down, and get like some about us info. And you can also sign up for the Realm newsletter to get all the latest news information about what we're doing.
Awesome. And Maya, I think for you, all of your info is on your site, right? So if you
It is on my site. I'm also on Facebook, and I have for anybody who is on this call and was asking about starting up, I also started a bit of a mentoring Discord for new editors or just editors who are trying to figure out ways to get business pricing, have questions if they have something that they're editing and they're like, holy cow, help me. So it's kind of so I started that up, and it's all people that I've been working with, but I'm trying to get other new folks in there. So like I said, I'm on Facebook. So if you would like to join that, just ping me and I'll get you added to that.
And so Maya, I was going to close with asking about people getting into editing. So I'll give you all the chance to talk about that. But I got a question in the chat. We've mentioned how traditional publishing editors might turn down a manuscript just because they don't have the time right then. But we've also mentioned how traditional publishing can take a year or two to get a book made. Why are these both true? And so maybe, Chris, do you want to take a stab at like explaining the publishing timeline at a big house?
Sure. So depending on what publishing house you work at, but most likely, and this is also something that I've been on the staff of the owner of, or been on a panel with the owner of Fall Staff Books, which is an indie publisher in North Carolina, I think. But we've talked about this, and normally a big 5 publisher in terms of general fiction will need about 10 to 13 months, depending on the book, to go from Word document to physical book. And that time is built in time for developmental editing and back and forth between the author and the editor, getting it into a spot that you need it to be. Then we kick off the production cycle, which goes off to a whole other department. And then we hire various freelancers, we hire proofreaders, we hire copy editors, we hire, and that all goes through its own passes. The copy edit gets 1 pass, proofreading gets 3 passes, and in that time, art is simultaneously working on your cover and getting, we're also reserving print space for your print date. And right now, I believe there are only 5 or 4 commercial printers still operating in North America that print traditional trade or books. One of those is owned by Penguin Random House. So you might get space on the printer if you're one of the other big 4. Mm-hmm. And then, so that, like, our schedule is built around that print schedule during the bad days of the end of the world and lockdown. Printing and paper got so in short supply that we would have to cancel like secondary printings of books to make room for other new books. So you are operating, when people say what was that buzzword that we were saying when the paperocalypse? Yeah, or the Suez Canal, like the supply chain, the publishing supply chain is its own monster that as a corporate entity, we have to tangle with. And so we're building around that. And then when you do anything in 4-color, most likely that is going to go to China for overseas printing because their 4-color printers are faster and cheaper. And so that adds on another 3 to 6 months just on your publication window, just because we ship the files over there and they get shipped back physically to our warehouses.
And so this is one thing where I feel like if you're indie publishing, I want to highlight that a lot of these steps get skipped or skimped, and it can really hurt you. And so to give you just an example, so because I was familiar with traditional publishing, when I was indie publishing my cookbook, I knew that that if I was hoping for a publisher's weekly review or a library journal review, I needed to get that in ideally 6 months in advance if I wanted. And at least 2 months, but ideally 6 months in advance. I needed a finished book to send to them ideally with a cover and everything, right? And similarly, if I was hoping to get magazine reviews, print magazines are also running at least 6 months in advance on their timelines, right? So if you have a book that you're hoping is going to be a holiday book coming out in November, December, they're making that issue in March, right?
Mhm.
And so you need to get your book to them 6 months in advance. And so that is part of what is built into giving you the time to really build out a good publicity schedule for your book. Means, planning to have your book ready 6 months before you want it to come out.
Mhm.
And that's not, I think, something that indie people are used to thinking about. And then again, step back from there. Okay, if the book has to be ready in March, right? So before that, it needs to have the cover design. It has to be proofread. Before the proofreading, it needs to be the copy editing. Before the copy editing, it's the developmental editing, right? So you're now easily, even working independently, looking at a year from the taking your manuscript and getting it to published, right? So, and if you rush it, and to be fair, right, I know a lot of people who do rapid release, indie published series on Kindle Direct Publishing, and they're working with a very different business model, is I guess the main thing I would say, right? They are not looking for, we're going to try and get these print reviews. We're not trying to get a good, a starred review in Publishers Weekly, et cetera, so on. They are going direct to the author and to the reader. And they are betting on sort of building fans and having quick impulse buy sales. You get to the end of the book, and you're ready to buy the next one in the series. And so they write fast and they publish fast, right?
Well, and a lot of those people, you don't see it, and indie publishing can sometimes be misleading. So I know several of those people, and they have built up a team behind them who are the editors and the cover artists and everything like that. And they have that down like clockwork.
Mhm.
And if you one crazy guy says he puts out a book a week, and it's like, dude, you're just out of your mind. But he's got the people in place so that so it means he doesn't have just one copy editor. He doesn't have just one proofer. He's got several people that he knows he can count on to get those books through the process. So one of the things from a freelance standpoint, and I'm sure, Diana, you've experienced this too, is sometimes you have to step back and go, okay, guys, my schedule for this time period is booked solid, or I am taking this time off, so I am not scheduling, and this is my next opening. And I've had people go, oh, but it's like, no, this is me time, because I don't get vacations. I don't get days off. I often work weekends. So December is my month off this year. I'm taking the month off, and I've got my stack of books that I'm going to be reading. So if you're hiring if you're hiring a freelance editor on that basis, understand that just because your book is ready now, and the editor you want might not have an opening for 3 months. So you have to decide if that's really the editor you want, or if you're going to go find somebody else. And if you're a consistent writer and you know what your writing schedule is and what you anticipate your timeline is, start pinging the editors early, get that set up early. And a lot of times, if you put down a deposit, they'll be willing to work with you if you have to push the date. But just realize it's also dependent on their schedule. So,
So we're almost at time. If people are able to stay a little bit longer, I would like to okay. So then I'd love to ask this last question of, let's say you want to get into editing. I have quite a few eager 18, 19-year-old students who are like, maybe I could be an editor. And they've been getting A's in their English classes, they've got some skills. What are the next steps, right? What would you recommend? Anyone who wants to jump in can start.
Well, the next step is really thinking about what kind of editor you want to be. Do you want to have your own business like Maya? Do you want to work for a company like Chris and I have? Do you want to work for a specific type of genre or press? I think all those things are worthwhile to think about when you are thinking about how you want to structure your career. And I know, like, when you're super new, those questions might not come immediately, and that's perfectly fine. What I do suggest is that there are a lot of really great mentorship programs, out there that can help give advice. There's something I always tell, people wanting to get into publishing as an industry to do, is that just, it is perfectly fine, in my opinion, take it with a grain of salt, your mileage may vary, to email someone and ask, is it okay if I ask for an informational interview? An hour of your time, a coffee, a Zoom call, I just have, but also treat it like a professional conversation. Come in with a list of very specific, questions, contact people that you have specific, ideas. Like, I want to interview people that work in genre. I want to interview people that work in nonfiction. Be very specific and precise about this, outreach. And out of a dozen or or so requests you might go out, there just might be one yes, but that yes could mean so much. And so I always
just say, try not to take it personally. If they say no, they really just don't have the time.
Right.
The vast majority of people, for me, I would have to say no to that almost always, because, anytime I have during the semester goes to my students first. I might have time at a convention, but I'm often heavily scheduled at cons. And after that, there's no time. There is no, I just have to say, no, I don't have time to have coffee with friends, good friends, much less total strangers.
I mean, also to that point, there's a lot of content being created out there that's looking for people starting out. Video game modding is a thing. You can get into something that's a really heavy story mod and you're just volunteering your time as editing. Blog sites need editing on their stuff. Don't lock yourself in. Don't do what I did when I was first starting out and being I want to edit science fiction and fantasy. It happened that I happened to wind up here, but what I really realized about myself is that I love the shape of story and story in general and narrative. And so once I found out that I can edit anything and work on anything and I help shape a story in the way that I hope to do professionally, a lot of opportunities open up to you. This is also why I think when the people are starting out writing and they tell you, most editors will tell you to read broadly and don't just read the genre that you want to write in, because there's a lot of different kinds of stories out there and it's always fun to play with.
Yeah.
Yep.
So one of the things that anytime I got asked about that is because I was coordinating that proofing team I mentioned early on. I basically said, here's our proofing test. And if you qualify, I'll stick you on one of the teams and here's your experience, practical experience. And the people that were in charge of collating all of that, they would give feedback to some of the folks. And I would let the leads know. I'm like, hey, this is a new person. They want to be an editor, so on and so forth. Unfortunately, that avenue is kind of closed to me right now because that particular project or that particular system is scaling back on work and everything. But if you can get on as a volunteer with a publisher or an author or something like that, then that might be a good way to get some hands-on experience. I'm sorry?
Oh, no, I was just a lit magazine at your school.
Yeah, lit magazine. So one of the other ways that the other publisher I started with is I got on his ARC advanced reader copy review team. And I'd be reading through. And so I did a couple of those. And then after 2 or 3 of those, I said, hey, what if I find errors as I'm going through? And he was very open. He's like, go ahead and send me the errors and we'll get those corrected before we release it. So I did another 2 or 3 of those. And then after that, I was like, hey, by the way.
I think, I might add, know what kind of editing you want to do and know what your skills are, right? Like,
Mhm.
and one way to learn that is by being in a group workshop and, seeing what of the feedback that you give is helpful to the people in your workshop. You can also volunteer as a first reader at various magazines is a great way to get a sense of what's out there, what people are submitting, see patterns. It's really good training, I think, for editorial work.
Yeah.
I will say, I think, knock on wood, a pretty good developmental editor, an okay copy editor, and a terrible proofreader. I am like, I miss all kinds of things. And I didn't know this, right, when I was in my 20s, because I was an English major. I was like, I knew books and whatever. And the University of Chicago Press had advertised that they were looking for copy editors, and I was like, and proofreaders, and I was like, oh, I could do that. And but they had a test, it was like a speed and accuracy test, and I went in and took the test, and I bombed it. I mean, just bombed it. I missed a whole bunch of things. I don't even think I finished in the time allotted, and it was, yeah. So. So yeah, know your strengths, I guess is what I'd say.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
The other thing is
oh, sorry, Maya and then Diana.
okay. So I just took a class with through the EFA, and they have both self-paced and led classes, and you can do it as a member or you can do it as a guest. The guest costs, of course, are a little bit higher. But if you take the beginning course for like their dev editing, their copy editing, and their proofreading, that may be a really good way to identify if that's the type of work that you're interested in. So it's a little bit of money up front again, but it goes a long way to determining whether or not you want to do that particular type of editing, I think.
That's great. Diana?
I also wanted to give a shout out. There's a couple of different programs for BIPOC that are mentoring programs. One is run by, POC and Publishing. So that they're currently in the middle of their current mentorship cohort, but they usually open up in the spring or so every year. I also want to recommend Representation Matters, repmatters.org. And they also do like rotational like mentorships. So check out their website and see when their next opening is for applications.
And this is something, I'm glad you brought that up. It's something one of my students said just a few weeks ago in class, an aspiring writer, POC, and he was discouraged. He was like, there's so many barriers, to getting published. And if you're writing, work out of your culture and community, and is it even worth trying? And I said, one of the ways we fix this is by having more of you do editing and publishing, we need to diversify on all levels, right? So to make it happen. All right. I have one last chat question, and I think we'll use that to close things off. And it's a very simple one. She asks, how many projects are editors, traditional and non-traditional, working on at one time?
It depends. For my freelance, I usually can do a beta and or a beta or dev and a copy or proof edit at the same time, just because they're two different types of things that I'm looking for. The qualifier on that is they have to be different genres. If they're the same genre, I'm screwed.
I can only work on one thing at a time. Like the summer that I was editing Survivor, that anthology, that's what I did all summer, right? Was reading scripts. It I did an open call, so there were a lot of manuscripts, and it just getting through the first pass took months, in fact. So
granted, I have one of the bigger lists due to a lot of other editors leaving the company, but normally I have about 20 to 30 titles a year. And that's split amongst 3 seasons, which is fall, winter, and spring, summer. So normally about 10 to 12, 10 to 15 titles per season, counting offsets, which are like hardcover to trade paper to mass market. And those don't require as much editing as like original novels and sequels.
All right, I gotta say, Chris, do you just read really, really fast?
Oh, no, I am a terribly slow reader, and that's one of my greatest weaknesses because it's just something that I have dyslexia and I've never been able to read fast. So I take a lot of time.
Yeah.
So, and also, when it comes to larger corporate houses, the level of editor that you are in the house, does influence how many books you're expected to acquire and how many books you're expected to edit, which are actually different numbers. Yeah.
Rough idea, like, can you?
It really all depends on the house and what their publishing strategy is. But when I was at Tor, I was, expected, at my peak to do between like 5 to 8 books a season. But again, as Chris noted, like a lot has changed in the last couple of years, and workloads are getting, higher, which is not necessarily the best.
Yeah. And for me, mine is broken out into blocks of time, and it's all based on word count. So depending on the type of project and depending on the word count and depending on what I have to do for it, that dictates whether or not I can stack different projects as well. So right now, for an average 100,000 word manuscript for a copy edit, that's 2 weeks in my schedule.
Okay, that's super helpful. And I guess I had one last comment. I know we're going to link to the EFA's guidelines on this, but just as a super rough estimate, if someone is looking to hire someone for a developmental edit on a novel, what's the ballpark of what's out there? Because I actually I have no idea. I'm like, is that $1,000? Is that $10,000? I don't even know. So
on the EFA, a dev edit's going to probably run anywhere from $2,000 to $5,000.
All right, that's helpful. Just to give a sense of where we are.
And that's for average, current average. So that's 80,000 to about 110,000 words, just for scale there.
Okay. So if you're writing one of Chris's monster books, scale up appropriately. So,
Right.
I tend to write short, so I'm like, oh, if my book's only 50,000 words, so I can buy with a little.
And of course, it's not an exponential increase in pricing. Right. So, but I mean, I think that's a good window, and it also depends on, like we said earlier, how much work is going to go into it, how much detail needs to be done at the. I mean, if you've got a pretty clean manuscript, whether it's developmental or otherwise, of course, it's going to be usually less expensive. Now, you will have editors that will charge you a flat rate regardless. So that's another thing to ask if you're an author looking for an editor is, do you base it on a sample and do you scale based on difficulty? Because typically, once you agree on the price, they're not going to give you a discount on the back end because it was easier.
That's right. That makes sense. Well, thank you all for agreeing to do this and staying late. I really appreciate it. So that is Maya Kleve of Marked Up Editing, Diana Pho of various places, including Realms, and her own business, Christopher Morgan of Tor currently. Just really appreciate you all taking the time, and this was just great. So
great.
All right,
thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful day and a great holiday.
Right.